In the vast empire of Rome, where marble temples gleamed under the Mediterranean sun and senators debated in the grand halls of the Forum, there existed another Rome, hidden in the shadows. It was the Rome of the enslaved, the broken, and the forgotten. Among them, the most fragile and voiceless were the children born into bondage. Their lives were not the stories of noble birth or heroic triumph that history often celebrates, but stories of survival, cruelty, and a childhood stolen before it ever truly began. To speak of enslaved children in Rome is to open a window into a world where innocence was traded as a commodity and youth was stripped of its dignity. In Roman society, slavery was not an exception, but a cornerstone. It was estimated that 1 in 3 inhabitants of Rome was a slave. They came from conquered lands, Gaul, Greece, Egypt, Carthage, Judea, and their children inherited their chains. Some were born in the cramped, airless quarters of urban households, while others were delivered in rural estates where their first breath of life was surrounded by the clatter of tools and the shouts of overseers. These children were not greeted with joy but with calculation. For their masters, the arrival of a newborn was not a cause for celebration, but a question. Would this child be useful, profitable, or expendable? From their earliest years, enslaved children were marked by deprivation. Unlike free-born Roman children who were swaddled in family traditions and initiated into Roman identity, slave children had no such inheritance. They were not taught to take pride in their name, for many had no name at all beyond the one given by their master, often simple, mocking, or utilitarian. They might be called after animals, physical traits, or numbers. To be named Secundus or Felix was not a gift, but a label, a reminder that they were one among many, their individuality erased in service to the household or estate that owned them. Daily life for these children was shaped entirely by the needs of their masters. In wealthy urban households, some began serving from the moment they could walk, carrying water, sweeping floors, or running errands for mistresses. Others were groomed for more specialized roles, page boys to accompany their young Roman counterparts, attendants who learned to anticipate the whims of their owners, or entertainers who were forced to sing, dance, or perform tricks for amusement. In the countryside, life was even harsher. Slave children were often left under the watch of elder slaves, while their parents toiled in the fields. As they grew older, they themselves were sent into the brutal rhythm of agricultural labor, enduring long hours under the sun, carrying loads far too heavy for their small bodies, and facing lashes if they faltered. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of their existence was the absence of security. A free-born Roman child could expect the protection of family, lineage, and law. A slave child had none of these. They could be sold at any moment, torn away from their parents, siblings, or friends without warning. The bustling slave markets of Rome and other cities were filled with such scenes. Children lined up in rows, their small frames examined like livestock, their teeth inspected, their health tested, their potential for labor priced. Buyers haggled as if selecting animals, indifferent to the cries or terror of the young. To grow up enslaved was to live with the constant awareness that love and bonds could be severed at the will of another. Some masters used children as investments, raising them only to sell them later at a higher value once they were trained in a skill. Others saw them as expendable, particularly those born sickly or weak. Ancient records hint at the chilling reality that unwanted infants, whether freeborn or enslaved, could be exposed, left to die. For slave children, the risk was even greater. A master unwilling to feed another mouth might abandon a newborn at the city's edge, consigning it to fate, whether that meant death, rescue, or capture by others who might raise the child only to resell it into slavery again. Education was another realm where the inequality was stark. While free Roman boys were prepared for citizenship with lessons in rhetoric, philosophy, and law, slave children received no such privileges unless their masters saw potential profit in training them. A clever child might be taught to read, write, or perform bookkeeping, not for their own advancement, but to better serve their owners. Some became scribes or secretaries, handling the daily affairs of a household. Others were trained in crafts such as pottery, weaving, or cooking, making them more valuable in the marketplace. But this education was never for the child's benefit. It was an investment in a tool, not a gift to a person. Beyond labor and training, many children faced even darker fates. Vulnerable and unprotected, they were at the mercy of the appetites of their masters. Ancient accounts, though often written with restraint, suggest that children could be subjected to abuses that today we would name without hesitation as exploitation and violation. In Rome, where power was absolute and ownership total, there was no law to protect a slave child from the desires of those who claimed dominion over them. To imagine the world of enslaved children in Rome is to confront a reality both intimate and tragic. They were not only denied the joys of childhood, but forced to carry burdens far beyond their years. They grew up in fear, in service, in silence, and yet within this darkness, there were flickers of humanity. Moments of laughter shared with other children, whispers of songs from their parents' homelands, fleeting bonds formed in the shadows of oppression. These fragile sparks remind us that even in the most dehumanizing conditions, the resilience of childhood found ways to endure, though it was always threatened by the weight of chains. The story of enslaved children in Rome is inseparable from the story of their parents, for the shadow of bondage extended across generations. When a woman was enslaved, any child she bore inherited her status. It did not matter who the father was. Whether another slave, a free citizen, or even the master himself, the child was born into slavery. This brutal principle, known as partus sequitur ventrum, meant that the womb of an enslaved woman was not only her own, but a vessel for her owner's wealth. Children were not blessings for their mothers, but assets for their masters. Each birth added another body to the ledger, another potential laborer to the household, another coin to the owner's fortune. For enslaved mothers, this reality brought a sorrow that is difficult to fathom. To cradle a newborn was to feel both love and despair, knowing that the child's first breath was also a sentence. This generational cycle of slavery ensured that many children never knew freedom. They grew up watching their parents toil endlessly, punished when they failed, beaten when they resisted. For a child, the whip was not a distant threat, but a daily presence. Small mistakes, a spilled jug of wine, a broken plate, a delayed errand, could bring lashes across their backs. The cruelty of Roman discipline was not softened for the young. In fact, some masters viewed harsh treatment as necessary to break a child into obedience, much as one might break a young animal for service. Fear was a tool of control, and it was instilled from the earliest years. Not all slave children experienced the same fate, however. The world they inhabited varied, depending on the wealth and disposition of their masters. In the households of the elite, where marble floors gleamed and banquets stretched long into the night, young slaves might be dressed neatly, trained to serve with grace, and kept close at hand as symbols of status. To own a retinue of child attendants was, for some aristocrats, a display of luxury. But even amid silk garments and gilded cups, these children were still slaves. Their smiles were rehearsed, their gestures practiced, their obedience absolute. A Roman guest might admire the elegance of such attendants without ever considering the cost at which their obedience had been purchased. In stark contrast were the children who labored in the vast rural estates that fed the empire. Here, sprawling fields of wheat and vineyards stretched to the horizon, worked by gangs of slaves under the watch of overseers. Children in such places were little more than extra hands to be trained. They learned to plant, weed, and harvest, often side by side with adults. The days were long, the work exhausting, and the punishments swift. Unlike in the city, there was little chance of learning a trade or gaining favor with the household. Rural slave children lived in crude barracks, slept on straw, and grew up in a cycle of labor that seemed endless. Many did not survive to adulthood, succumbing to exhaustion, disease, or malnutrition. The mortality rate among slave children was staggering. Ancient Rome lacked modern medicine, and for those in bondage, care was minimal. If a child fell ill, the master would weigh the cost of treatment against the child's potential value. For many, the calculation was cruelly simple. If the child was unlikely to recover quickly or become profitable in the future, it was cheaper to let them die. Archaeological evidence from Roman cemeteries reveals heartbreaking truths. Tiny skeletons with signs of malnutrition, disease, and even physical trauma. These were not isolated cases, but the norm for countless enslaved children whose lives ended before they had barely begun. Some children, however, were marked for very different paths. The Romans were pragmatic, and a child with unusual talents could be molded into something more. A beautiful child might be trained as a household ornament, a singer, or even a concubine. A clever child might be taught Greek or Latin, becoming a secretary, tutor, or companion for the master's children. Such positions offered certain privileges: better food, lighter labor, perhaps even a closer relationship with the master's family. But these privileges were precarious. A child who lost favor could be demoted, punished, or sold at a moment's notice. Affection from a master was never protection. It was a chain of a different kind. There were also children who were forced into the world of spectacle. Rome's appetite for entertainment was insatiable, and children were not spared from being part of it. Some were trained as acrobats, jesters, or performers, expected to amuse guests at feasts. Others were pushed into more violent arenas. While gladiatorial combat was usually the domain of adults, there is evidence that children, too, were sometimes forced to fight. Perhaps not in the grand amphitheaters, but in smaller spectacles for private audiences. To the Roman elite, even the suffering of children could be entertainment. The psychological toll of such a life is almost impossible to measure, but fragments of evidence give us glimpses. Some ancient writers hinted at the despair of enslaved children, describing them as silent shadows who moved through households unnoticed, speaking little, smiling only when commanded. And others noted the resilience and adaptability of youth, how children formed bonds with each other, inventing games, whispering stories, and sharing what scraps of joy they could. For them, friendship was an act of survival, a small defiance against the overwhelming weight of their condition. Yet even these fragile joys were haunted by the ever-present threat of separation, for a friend today could be sold tomorrow. Rome prided itself on law and order, on civilization and justice. Yet for enslaved children there was no justice at all. The law recognized them as property, not as people. They could not appeal to a court, could not claim a right, could not resist an owner. Their existence was defined entirely by the will of another. To be a slave child in Rome was to live in a world where your body, your future, your very breath belonged to someone else. When we picture children, we imagine play, laughter, and a world of possibilities. For enslaved children in Rome, however, play was a luxury rarely afforded, and possibilities were chained to the will of others. Childhood, as we understand it today, hardly existed for them. Their days were consumed by duties, and even their moments of leisure were often dictated by the demands of their masters. Yet in the cracks of their oppression, children sometimes carved out fragile spaces for themselves. They might use sticks and pebbles to invent games in the corners of the estate, or whisper stories from their parents' homelands, tales of distant gods, lost kingdoms, or imagined freedom. These small acts were not simply diversions, but ways to preserve a sense of identity in a world determined to erase it. But even these fleeting respites could be crushed by discipline. The Roman world had a reputation for harshness, and nowhere was this clearer than in the punishments inflicted upon slaves. For children, whose small mistakes were inevitable, punishments could be both frequent and severe. Beatings were common, and humiliation was sometimes used to enforce obedience. A child might be made to carry a heavy load as a form of disgrace, or forced to stand for hours under the watchful eye of an overseer. In some households, disobedience meant being branded with hot irons, marking the child permanently as both a possession and a transgressor. To modernize, such treatment is unbearable to imagine, yet to the Romans it was considered normal, an accepted part of maintaining order in a system built on dominance. The violence went beyond physical punishment. Psychological control was just as effective. Children were taught from their earliest years that they had no worth outside their labor. They were reminded daily that they were owned, that their lives could be bought and sold like a tool or an animal. This relentless conditioning shaped how they saw themselves and their world. Some accepted it in silence, too afraid to resist. Others carried within them a quiet defiance, waiting for the rare moment when resistance might be possible. A handful of ancient accounts tell of children who ran away, slipping into the alleys of the city or hiding among the crowds of the marketplace. But escape was almost impossible. Runaway slaves were hunted, and the penalties for capture were brutal: beatings, branding, even execution. For a child, survival on the streets of Rome without protection or allies was nearly hopeless. The city might offer hiding places, but it was also filled with danger, exploitation, and starvation. There was, however, one faint light in the darkness of slavery: the possibility of manumission. In Rome, a slave could be freed under certain circumstances, often as a reward for long or faithful service. For children, this meant that if they were fortunate enough to win the favor of their masters, or if their masters were particularly generous, they might be set free. Some were freed as teenagers or young adults and given the status of freedmen, though even this freedom carried limits, for they still owed loyalty and obligations to their former masters. Yet for a child who had known nothing but chains, the hope of manumission could become a guiding star. Parents sometimes clung to this hope for their children, praying that their son or daughter might live to see freedom, even if they never did themselves. The fate of slave children also intersected with Rome's obsession with spectacle. Some were selected for training in the gladiatorial schools, though this was less common than for adults. Still, children were sometimes forced into mock combats for the amusement of crowds or wealthy patrons. Imagine a child, barely old enough to wield a weapon, thrust into a ring to entertain the whims of others. The crowd cheered, coins exchanged hands, and the child's fear was invisible beneath the roar of the amphitheater. The Romans admired strength, discipline, and spectacle, but rarely paused to consider the humanity of those providing it, especially if they were slaves. Despite all this, children found ways to resist, even if subtly. One form of resistance was the preservation of memory. Enslaved parents would tell their children stories of their homeland, teaching them songs, words, or customs that reminded them of a world beyond Rome's chains. These fragments of culture, passed down in whispers, became acts of quiet defiance, preserving an identity the empire sought to erase. Another form of resistance lay in the simple act of surviving, enduring punishment, hunger, and sorrow, yet still finding moments to laugh, to dream, to cling to each other. For a child in Rome, to survive was itself a rebellion against a system that devalued their existence. Religion, too, played a role in their endurance. Many enslaved children inherited the gods of their parents, Celtic deities, Egyptian gods, or Jewish traditions. In the secrecy of night, small prayers might be whispered, offerings hidden, rituals remembered. For others, exposure to Roman religion became a strange source of comfort. Participating in festivals, even from the margins, offered a rare taste of joy. The processions, music, and rituals gave them a glimpse of belonging, however fleeting. In time, some adopted Roman gods, perhaps out of hope that these powerful deities might ease their suffering. Still others encountered early Christianity, which spread quietly through Rome's lower classes. The Christian promise of equality before God and the hope of salvation beyond this world resonated deeply with those who had nothing in this life, including enslaved children. We must also consider the role of masters' children, for many young Roman citizens grew up side by side with enslaved children. In the wealthy households of Rome, a senator's son might share his childhood with a slave attendant of the same age. They might play together, study together, even sleep in the same room. Yet one child grew up with every expectation of power and privilege, while the other was reminded daily of their subservience. These relationships were complicated. Sometimes genuine friendships blossomed, other times the line of ownership was reinforced with cruelty. For the enslaved child, such bonds could be bittersweet, offering companionship but never equality. A reminder always hung over them. One was free, the other was not. Perhaps the most haunting truth of all is that many of these children never lived long enough to imagine adulthood. Disease swept through cramped living quarters, hunger weakened young bodies, and labor wore them down before their time. Those who did survive often bore scars, physical, emotional, or both, that marked them for life. Their childhood was not a period of innocence, but of endurance, not a beginning of possibilities, but a struggle against overwhelming odds. And yet, despite the darkness, the story of enslaved children in Rome is not only one of despair, but also of endurance. They remind us that even in the harshest conditions, the human spirit seeks light. Their laughter in stolen moments, their whispered stories, their dreams of freedom. All these fragments are testaments to resilience. They may not have written their stories, but their lives echo through the ruins of Rome, asking us to remember the cost at which empire was built. To fully understand the plight of enslaved children in ancient Rome, one must also see them not only as human beings, but as Rome itself regarded them, as economic units. The Roman Empire thrived on the labor of slaves, and children were part of this machinery from the moment they were born. Their bodies, their skills, and even their futures were calculated like assets in a ledger. Masters debated whether it was more profitable to raise children born into slavery or to purchase new slaves from the bustling markets. Some landowners, like the famously harsh agricultural writer Cato the Elder, recommended against investing too heavily in raising young slaves. To him, slaves were tools, and tools were discarded when they ceased to be useful. Such attitudes reveal the cold logic under which children were forced to grow up. They were measured not by their laughter or potential, but by their projected value in labor. Slave markets were a central stage in this cruel economy. Here, children were displayed for sale alongside adults, their fates decided in moments by the bids of strangers. Buyers would prod their limbs, inspect their teeth, and question their origins. A child's worth varied depending on age, health, and potential usefulness. Younger children, though unable to work immediately, could be considered long-term investments, trained into whatever role the master required. Older children, especially those who showed physical strength, fetched higher prices, ready to be thrust into labor with little delay. Beauty, too, could inflate a child's price, particularly if they were destined to serve as attendants, or, in more disturbing cases, as objects of their master's desire. To the market, children were commodities, stripped of identity, voice, and choice. For wealthier Romans, slave children could be tools of prestige. To display a retinue of young attendants at a banquet or in the streets of Rome was to flaunt both wealth and power. Guests might admire the discipline and charm of these children without ever questioning the pain beneath their trained smiles. For poorer Romans who might own only one or two slaves, a child was often seen as a burden unless they could contribute quickly to the household. This could lead to even harsher treatment, for in smaller homes, every pair of hands was expected to work to capacity. There was no room for weakness, no patience for mistakes. In both contexts, the enslaved child's humanity was ignored in favor of their utility. The Roman legal system reinforced this dehumanization. Children, like adults, were regarded strictly as property. They could be sold, loaned, or even killed at the discretion of their masters without fear of legal consequence. A master who decided to expose an infant, abandoning it to die, faced no punishment. The law did not ask whether the child deserved to live, only whether the master had the right to dispose of what was, in Roman eyes, his possession. Some jurists discussed the issue of child slaves in coldly practical terms, comparing them to livestock. The concept of childhood innocence, so central to many cultures today, held little sway in the Roman world when it came to slaves. A child was not seen as a vulnerable being in need of protection, but as a developing worker, a potential profit, or a liability to be discarded. And yet, despite these harsh realities, there were instances where enslaved children could alter their fate. A few were adopted into households, raised alongside free children, and treated with unusual kindness. Others, through exceptional talent, won the admiration of their masters and were granted privileges far beyond the average slave. There are records of slaves who rose to positions of considerable influence after being freed, becoming scribes, teachers, or even wealthy freedmen. But such stories, while remarkable, should not obscure the suffering of the vast majority. For every child who was favored, countless others lived and died in obscurity, their lives unrecorded and unremembered. The tragedy is that most of what we know about enslaved children comes not from their own voices, but from the fragments left by their masters, from inscriptions, and from the silence of archaeology. Inscriptions sometimes record the grief of parents, slave or free, mourning the loss of a child. Tombstones reveal the heartbreakingly short lives of many, marked by dates that show children dying at 5, 7, or 10 years old. Archaeological digs uncover the bones of the young in mass graves, often showing signs of malnutrition or abuse. These traces tell a story that written histories often ignored, for Roman historians were far more interested in the deeds of emperors and generals than in the fates of the enslaved. The lives of slave children existed in the margins, and it is only through careful study that we begin to piece together their experiences. To imagine the daily reality of these children is to confront a world where joy was fleeting and survival was uncertain. A child might rise with the dawn, carry out endless tasks under the harsh gaze of an overseer, eat meager scraps left from the household, and collapse into sleep on a cold floor, only to repeat the same cycle the next day. Their games, if they had them, were stolen moments between duties, fragile escapes into imagination. Their friendships were tempered by the knowledge that separation could come at any time, and their futures were almost always limited, bound by the expectations of labor until death or, for the lucky few, manumission. The society that surrounded them rarely saw this suffering. For the average Roman citizen, slavery was so ingrained in daily life that it went unquestioned. The cries of a child being punished, the sight of a boy carrying loads too heavy for his frame, or the sale of a girl in the marketplace, all of this was considered ordinary. Compassion was not absent from Roman culture, but it rarely extended to slaves, and even less to enslaved children. The empire prided itself on its civilization, its laws, its achievements in art and architecture, yet at its foundation lay countless young lives crushed beneath the weight of bondage. When we walk through the ruins of Rome today, we see the grandeur, the Colosseum, the aqueducts, the triumphal arches. What we do not see are the children who hauled the stones, cleaned the floors, served at the tables, or cried quietly in the dark of slave quarters. Their presence is felt only in absence, a haunting silence that reminds us that behind every monument of power lies an untold story of those who paid the price. The voices of enslaved children are lost to history, but their lives were real, their suffering immense, and their endurance a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The story of enslaved children in Rome is not only a chapter in the history of slavery, it is a mirror that reflects the foundations of an empire. Rome's glory was built not just on the triumphs of its legions or the wisdom of its philosophers, but also on the backs of those who had no voice. And among them, the children endured perhaps the most heartbreaking fate of all, a life stripped of innocence before it could ever fully bloom. When we speak of the grandeur of Rome, we must also speak of the small hands that labored unseen, of the young bodies that were sacrificed to uphold a system of dominance, and of the lives erased from the record of history. The paradox of Rome was striking. On one hand, it celebrated childhood among its free citizens. Roman boys underwent ceremonies marking their transition into manhood, and Roman girls were cherished as the future of families and alliances. Parents erected tombs for their children, inscribed with tender words of loss, mourning the brevity of life. Yet, for the enslaved child, there was no such recognition. Their deaths were rarely recorded, their graves often unmarked, their names forgotten. Rome could celebrate the joy of free childhood while ignoring the suffering of enslaved childhood, a hypocrisy that reveals the deep moral fractures of its society. And yet, these children were not entirely invisible. They appeared at the edges of Roman literature, sometimes as nameless figures carrying trays at a banquet or standing silently in the background of a household scene. Poets occasionally remarked on the innocence of a slave boy or the beauty of a young attendant, though rarely with compassion for their plight. More often, they were painted as ornaments to the lives of their masters. Even in art, their humanity was obscured, reduced to symbols of wealth and luxury. But beneath these portrayals was a truth that cannot be erased. These children were real, they lived and breathed, and their suffering was as profound as any in history. What lessons, then, do their stories hold for us today? First, they remind us that empires and civilizations often hide their darkest realities behind monuments and achievements. Rome is celebrated for its laws, roads, and architecture, but it is vital to remember that such greatness was financed by human misery. The laughter of free Roman children was accompanied by the silence of enslaved ones. To forget this is to celebrate only half the truth of Rome's legacy. Second, their stories challenge us to rethink how we view childhood across history. Childhood is often assumed to be a universal stage of innocence and play. Yet for millions of children throughout history, and even in our world today, it has been shaped by labor, violence, and exploitation. The children of Rome are not distant figures in an ancient tragedy. They are reminders of a struggle that continues in different forms across time. Some scholars argue that the resilience of enslaved children is itself a legacy worth remembering. Despite the chains, the punishments, and the dehumanization, these children found ways to survive. They laughed, they played, they dreamed, however briefly. In their ability to endure, they reveal something deeply human, the refusal to be entirely broken by oppression. Their whispered songs, their fleeting friendships, and their quiet hopes were acts of defiance in a world that sought to silence them. If Rome sought to erase their individuality, history's task is to restore it, even if only in memory. The silence of enslaved children is also a call to empathy. Unlike emperors or generals, they left no speeches, no triumphs, no monuments. But their absence in the historical record speaks loudly if we are willing to listen. Each ruin of Rome, each crumbling wall or abandoned villa, should remind us not only of the power that once was, but of the countless forgotten lives that sustained it. Behind the polished marble and grand arenas were children whose tears were never recorded, whose voices were never heard. To tell their story now is an act of restoration, a way of granting them the dignity denied in their lifetimes. In the end, the lives of enslaved children in ancient Rome were marked by suffering, but also by endurance. They lived in chains, yet they carried within them sparks of humanity that Rome could never fully extinguish. They were denied freedom, yet some lived to see manumission and even built new lives as freedmen. They were stripped of identity, yet their existence shaped the very society that tried to erase them. To acknowledge them is to acknowledge that Rome's greatness was never untainted, It was built on a foundation of inequality, where the weak bore the burdens that allowed the strong to flourish. As we close the story of these children, we must remember that history is not only the tale of the victorious, but also the memory of the voiceless. The enslaved children of Rome cannot speak to us directly, but their silence is heavy with meaning. They remind us that every society, no matter how glorious, must be judged not only by what it builds, but also by how it treats its most vulnerable. Rome failed its children in bondage, and that failure casts a long shadow across its history. Yet by remembering them, by telling their story, we allow them at last to step out of the shadows and into the light of human dignity. And so when we think of Rome, not only of its emperors and battles, but of its streets, its markets, its fields, we should also think of the children who walked those same paths with chains on their ankles. They are part of Rome's story, as essential as its victories and monuments. Their lives were short, their voices silenced, but their memory can endure if we choose to carry it forward. For in remembering them, we not only honor their resilience but also confront the uncomfortable truth that the greatness of civilizations is often built on the suffering of the smallest and weakest among us.